500 and so on, was articulated in the poems of Homer and Hesiod, the Iliad, the story of the wrath of Achilles at the end of the Trojan War, and the Odyssey, the story of the 10-year return of Odysseus after the war to his patient wife Penelope, waiting for him. If your wife complains because you're late home, you've got a perfect example. Or your husband, actually. Let's not be sexist about this. And the poems of Hesiod, the Theogony, which means generation of the gods, and a little bit in his Works and Days. And the very title of Hesiod's poem, Theogony, Generation of the Gods, immediately tells you that we're into a different way of thinking about divine beings. First of all, there's more than one of them. And secondly, they're generated. And the very first line of Hesiod's poem, Theogony, says, "First of all, chaos came into being." Now, chaos is not what we mean today by chaos. It's the Greek word chaos. It's just the same word that's become transliterated into English, but it's required a different meaning than it had back then. What it means is a gap. And indeed, our word gap, I suspect, may go back to the root cha of chaos. And the gap that Hesiod is speaking about is the gap between heaven and earth. So the supposition is, before the world order in which we live, with the earth on which we stand and the heavenly bodies up above that we can see, before that came into being, everything was all together. And then there was a kind of gap, and you have the heaven above and the earth below, who are personified. Heaven is Uranos, after whom the planet Uranus is named. That's just that Greek word. And the earth is Gaia. So the male sky god, heavenly god, Uranos, and the female earth god, Gaia. And this account of creation, which has no gods prior to it, is actually a fairly common pattern in Near Eastern mythology, and indeed one of the two versions of creation in the book of Genesis of the Hebrew Bible is like that. Darkness was on the face of the deep, etc., and you get this splitting apart of the heavens from the earth. In Hesiod, the heaven and earth are personified, and they start going at it in the way that males and females do, and they most of the subsequent generation of the gods is through sexual interaction and female goddess giving birth. So the gods are immortal. That's an assumption of Greek thought generally, and indeed the immortals is kind of a synonym for the divine beings, but they are generated. So they have a beginning. They don't have an end, but they have a beginning. And they certainly don't create, the stuff out of which we and things we encounter and the earth we stand on are made. Maybe those stuffs, in a certain way, are thought of as divine. There's a kind of animism, if you like, in this thought. And in Hesiod's poem, there is a kind of systematization of the stories that were part of the traditions existing in his time, of the names of the various gods, what they did, what they got up to. And in particular, there is a rather savage tale of a conflict between the children of Uranos and Gaia, heaven and earth, and Uranos. I think this is the one where Kronos cuts off the genitals of Uranos with a sickle, and the drops of blood form, and the Titans are created out of this. And then Kronos becomes the subsequent sky god, and he too has a partner, a female earth goddess, and they too have children, and Kronos is doing nasty things, hiding the children in the earth, so they can't come out, and earth is groaning, and finally Zeus, leads them in a kind of one of the children of Kronos and Rhea, I think is the name of the earth goddess in the second generation, in a revolt against Kronos and that generation of gods, and they win in the battle, and that generation is the Olympian gods that we're familiar with, Zeus being the main one, and the others like Hera and Hephaestus and Athena and all these were supposed to dwell up on Mount Olympus. Well, these are very humanly conceived gods and goddesses, not particularly morally, praiseworthy, and not the best models to be teaching your children, but it's those stories that the children were reading. They read Homer and Hesiod. If you learned to read, that's what you'd learn. You'd memorize these poems. So the early Greek thinkers who began to reflect about religious matters, and we're talking here the late 6th century, about 500 BCE. You could hardly say that they differentiated themselves as philosophers. They were sort of thoughtful people. They criticized the anthropomorphic popular conceptions, and in particular these stories that the gods were up to things that were morally blameworthy. And the first of these is very interesting thinker, Xenophanes, who was a poet, says in his poem, of which we have quite a number of quotations, although not the whole poem, that he wrote this poem at the age of 92. So this gives old folks like me and one or two of you in the audience, and even Schreiber, some hope. So the first quotation here points out a fact that Homer and Hesiod have ascribed to the gods deeds which among men are a reproach and a disgrace. The second one points out the anthropomorphism of the representation of the gods by different cultures, obviously implying that what any particular culture represents a god as being like, insofar as it's simply a projection of characteristics specific to that culture, doesn't have any standing over against that of some other culture. So we have this quotation, Ethiopians say that their gods are flat-nosed and dark, Thracians that theirs are blue-eyed and red-haired. And you can guess, even if you didn't know, what Ethiopians looked like in those days and what Thracians looked like. And in the next quotation, Xenophanes extends this point about the sort of relativism of our conceptions of the gods among different peoples by pointing out how animals would conceive of the gods if they had these conceptions. And so he says, if oxen and horses and lions had hands and were able to draw with their hands and do the same things as men, horses would draw the shapes of God to look like horses, and oxen to look like oxen, etc. So you have... Thank you. You have...
No, I'm not thinking. I'm not giving you any attribute to that. But anyway, I would like to say that